listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Only needing a 5% deposit to buy a home sounds too good to be true. But the federal government has just fast-tracked an expansion of the First Homebuyer Guarantee to do just that, making it more accessible for thousands of Australians.
Keep in mind, the lower the deposit you have, usually the higher interest rate you will pay. So, yes, you don't need to save up a 10 or 20% deposit, but getting a home loan with a 5% deposit will usually mean you'll have to pay at a higher interest rate.
So how do you know if you're eligible, and will the new changes cause house prices to actually rise? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Dan Mullins. It's Tuesday, the 26th of August.
Hey Helen, and to you listening, AUKUS, Australia's strategic defence partnership with the United Kingdom and the United States, has come under further scrutiny as a former top Pentagon official urges Australia for a more concrete commitment. Defence Minister Richard Marles has arrived in Washington, D.C. for high-level talks with the Trump administration. His visit coincides with a new report on the effectiveness of the pact, particularly Australia's commitment to buying Virginia-class submarines off the US. Here's Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton.
I don't think they're reviewing it to consider increasing the size of the deal. I think it's more a question of how much of a downsize they're looking at, including potentially total cancellation, which would be catastrophic, a huge mistake for the U.S., with enormous consequences, obviously, for Australia and the UK.
The same John Bolton who is now under investigation by the FBI under orders from Trump. Now, the report was compiled by Abraham Denmark, a former top Pentagon official and senior AUKUS advisor to Joe Biden's Defence Secretary, Lloyd Austin, and Charles Edel, the Australian chair for the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. The report says AUKUS is a strategic imperative for the US, Australia and the UK, and backed the Trump administration's review of the Defence Pact, but urged it not to abandon it, saying that would make the US less capable in the region. The US review comes after Australia paid another $800 million to the US as part of the deal earlier this year, totalling to a $1.6 billion commitment from our government. Mr. Marles will meet with US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth and other senior Trump administration officials in Washington, D.C. this week.
At least 20 people, including 5 journalists and health officials, have been killed by Israel after an Israeli strike on the main hospital in southern Gaza. The top floor of the hospital was hit, killing at least one journalist from Reuters and others, which prompted media and rescuers to the scene, but just 15 minutes later, another Israeli bomb struck. The second strike was captured on live video, killing those who rushed to help, including journalists from Al Jazeera and the Associated Press.
The attack is being called a double-tap bombing tactic used by Israel that often results in fatal killings for journalists and first responders who rush to the scene of the first strike only to be hit by another one later. The killings have prompted a wave of international condemnation from the US, the UK, France and Germany, with the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy calling for an immediate ceasefire. The Israel Defence Forces admitted to the strikes on the hospitals and say an initial inquiry will be conducted.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he deeply regrets the tragic mishap and that Israel values the work of journalists, medical staff and civilians despite the double-tap strike. Since October 2023, Israel has killed more than 200 journalists reporting on the war in Gaza, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Hot potato, hot potato.
And the Wiggles are headed for court. Luke O'Neill, the group's former CEO, is suing them for breaches of the Fair Work Act and other claims. O'Neill worked as a consultant for Wiggles Holdings Proprietary Limited before becoming CEO in January 2024, and in the claims leaked to The Guardian, O'Neill claims the Blue Wiggle, Anthony Field, undermined him in front of other staff and excluded him from a meeting with Kmart to discuss selling their toys.
O'Neill is suing Wiggles Holding Proprietary Limited, Field and General Counsel Matthew Salgo for not being paid a bonus relating to his work and for multiple alleged breaches of the Fair Work Act. He says he was sacked by the Wiggles in May this year, a dismissal he claims was an adverse action under the Fair Work Act. The Wiggles, Field and Salgo are yet to file a defence in relation to the case, which is set to be heard by Justice Michael Lee. A first case management hearing is scheduled for the 8th of September.
And a third person has been charged over the alleged murder of teenager Pheobe Bishop in Queensland earlier this year. 30-year-old Kieran Daniel Middlehauser appeared in court yesterday accused of interfering with the investigation. The court heard he allegedly used Phoebe's phone after her disappearance on May 15 in Bundaberg.
Phoebe, who lived in the regional town of Gingin, planned to catch a flight from Bundaberg to visit her boyfriend in Western Australia, but she never made it to the airport. A massive search was launched, and weeks later, her body was found in Goodnight Scrub National Park. Her Gingin housemates, James Wood and Tanika Bromley, have been charged with murder and remain in custody. Kieran Daniel Middlehauser will also remain in custody before he returns to court on October 13.
And Charlotte Walker, Australia's youngest senator, delivered her maiden speech to the Parliament last night. The Labor senator, who turned 21 on election night, said she battled depression and bullying before her win at the May poll. The South Australian told the Parliament when she was 18 she tried to work out why she couldn't sleep, and it was depression.
During my term in Parliament, I want to shine a light on how childhood experiences like mine can continue to affect your mental health into adulthood and explore meaningful ways to address this.
She said people have accused her of being privileged because she went to a private school, but the truth was her mum scraped together the money because she was being bullied and was forced out of her local public school in Year 4. She also took a swipe at others in the House who are arguing against climate change.
In 2050, I won't be in my late 90s like some who want to abandon net zero. My friends and I will be in our 40s, and we demand an inhabitable planet.
It's nice to hear a young voice in Parliament, Helen, talking sense.
Yeah, 100%. And that brings our headlines to a close for today. Coming up next is my deep dive with David Koch, or Kochie, on whether the federal government's First Homebuyer Guarantee will actually help Aussies entering the housing market or just pump up those prices. Have a listen to that coming up next. First homebuyers have just got another boost from the Albanese government, who announced they are bringing forward the start date for the expansion of the First Homebuyer Guarantee. The scheme allows first home buyers to borrow to buy a home with just a 5% deposit, and it was set to commence early 2026, but now will begin in October. The scheme also enables buyers to avoid lender's mortgage insurance, meaning they'll save tens of thousands of dollars when they buy a home. And while the scheme has been around for a while, new price cap and income limits on eligibility will rise significantly, meaning more Aussies can access it. For example, price caps will go from $900,000 to $1.5 million in Sydney, from $800,000 to $950,000 in Melbourne, and from $700,000 to $1 million in Brisbane. But what does this all mean for our housing and affordability crisis? And how do you know if you're eligible? David Koch, or Kochie, is Compare the Market's Economic Director. David, what does the 5% deposit guarantee mean for first home buyers?
It allows them easier access to finance in terms of getting into their first home. Usually 5% deposit means it has to come with mortgage insurance, so that will be waived as a result of this, so it's a saving to borrowers. And you can apply for a loan instead of with 10, 15, 20% deposit. You can do it with 5%. So theoretically, that makes it a whole lot easier for people to access finance to get into a property. However, you still have to meet the lending criteria of the financial institution. They will still apply the 3% safety net of assuming you can afford repayments if interest rates are much higher than they are now, but also extending the eligibility to the 5% deposit means those people who are on better incomes that were previously excluded from it are now included. So that's a good thing as well. But there are lots of consequences, the ripple effect of this, both good and bad, that people have to be aware of.
And speaking about some of those caps that will be increased, how many Australians will be able to access this scheme?
So the government comes up with a whole bunch of, of different figures on this, but it's a couple of 100,000 that will be able to access it if they want to access it. As I said, people got to keep it in perspective. Yes, it's going to be easy to access finance, but you've still got to make sure you can afford the repayments. And when you have interest rates coming down, lending ceilings widen. As interest rates come down, people are able to borrow more. And then you add on the 5% deposit that previously excluded a lot of people. They're now included. So they're able to borrow more with less, and everyone's got to weigh up their own financial situation that maybe you will have access to this finance. Yes, you will be able to borrow more. Can you afford to repay it? Does it match your lifestyle? Are you willing to make the sacrifices that if you're able to borrow more and stretch yourself, and then there are higher repayments, you may have to cut back in other areas. It's not a silver bullet for everybody to say, hey, wacko, we've got access to more finance. Previous we were excluded, maybe for the right reasons, because you weren't able to afford it. Now we are included, and you may not be able to afford it still. And also keep in mind, the lower the deposit you have, usually the higher interest rate you will pay. So, yes, you don't need to save up a 10 or 20% deposit, but getting a home loan with a 5% deposit will usually mean you'll have to pay a higher interest rate than those who have saved up a 20% deposit. So that's what I mean about the good and the bad, the consequences of this scheme. Sounds great on paper, but there are a lot of things people have got to be aware of.
Yeah, and with that affordability in mind, a lot of the conversations for first home buyers and young buyers trying to enter the market is exactly that. They're not as worried about the deposit. They might have that deposit saved, but it's these repayments and the high repayments that are making them worried. How is the government addressing those concerns?
Well, they're not really addressing them at all and can't address them because that's the free market. Yes, we're in an interest rate easing cycle. So that's a good thing for borrowers at the moment. You know, we've had a couple of interest rate cuts, likely another one before the end of the year, one, maybe two. So home loan repayments will be coming down anyhow to make it easier. So at least you're not, this isn't being introduced in a rate cycle that's rising. It's being introduced in a rate cycle that's easing. That's some comfort, but also the safety net qualifications that the banks put in place to make sure you could handle a significantly higher interest rate than you're borrowing for at the moment is a good thing, and that will be a filter for a lot of borrowers going forward. More people going into the property market creates demand. Is that going to start putting up property values anyhow? So it's a tight property market at the moment, particularly those small to middle ranking capital cities, the Brisbanes, the Perths, the Adelaides of the world, strong property market. This just put more pressure on values there. Melbourne easing or softer, probably the softer the big capital cities. Sydney basically steady as she goes. We're going into spring selling season. That's usually an increase in demand anyhow.
And speaking of this increase of demand, what are the potential risks for this scheme being fast track? Will it make houses increase and prices go up?
Well, it will definitely increase demand. That's the whole reason for it, to allow more first home buyers to get into the market. That naturally increases demand at a time where the property market is in a bit of a squeeze. Like, property market's pretty simple to understand. You can't generalise. It depends where you live. It's all about supply and demand. Australia needs 250,000 new dwellings a year to keep the demand-supply balance in order. We've seriously been producing a lot less than that, and that's been creating this property squeeze. It's something that was discussed at the Productivity Roundtable last week to try and get rid of the barriers for more housing supply to come on, because at the moment it's just not. This government scheme of saying they wanted to produce a million houses over 4 years is going to fall drastically short. So that's creating the squeeze in terms of supply coming in. Demand is being increased by falling interest rates and 5% deposit schemes. That squeeze is going to be intensified by something like this. So for first home buyers, be aware, probably pay a higher interest rate. Be aware, values are probably going to be going up as well. So, for a first home buyer, that can be good because it means their equity in their home should increase over the next couple of years, which is a good thing.
So while the scheme is going to help thousands of Australians, critics say that it's not the solution to the affordability crisis. What are some other policies in the works that could help do this?
It's all about supply. It's all about reducing the obstacles for building approvals, not only building approvals to be granted, and that means more land, more rezoning, but also the obstacles to actually getting the houses completed. At the moment, we've got building approvals, which is the first step to more housing, getting councils to approve it. So that's falling well short of any of the targets that governments have actually imposed. But then the time it takes to complete a property after building approvals has got longer as well. And that's because you've got builders going broke, because the cost of construction and particularly the cost of labour has gone through the roof. Builders, people that would work on a building site, are now working for government infrastructure projects and energy renewal schemes, building windmills and solar plants and things like that, because they're getting paid more. So here's a builder trying to complete properties that has cost of construction going up and a shortage of labour, because that labour has left building houses and gone and worked for the government on their infrastructure schemes. So to attract them back, they have to offer more money, and that pushes building costs up even higher. So it's a really vicious cycle in the home construction and building industry at the moment that the governments have just got to sort out. That's the big issue for the housing sector at the moment. Government is competing against them.
So for anyone who's thinking of applying or using this scheme, what would your top tips advice be before doing so?
Do your budget. Do a household budget to make sure you can make the repayments that you're going to need to make, because you're borrowing 95% of the value of the property. You're only using 5% deposit because the government's allowing you to do that. So you're having to borrow more, which means higher repayments. Number one tip is absolutely, can you afford it? Yes, it looks attractive. Yes, it lets you get into the market, but cut your coat according to your cloth. And I think that's the critical area.
David, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Helen.
That was David Koch from Compare the Market. And as the federal parliament sits this week and the next, we can expect to hear more about the scheme over the next fortnight. But that's it for this episode. While you're there, though, if you could rate and review The Briefing wherever you're listening from, it's a really easy way you can support everything we do here on the show. And you can find us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.